This is clearly a woman who was thinking about how other women live their lives. And I'd love to see that as more of a part of fashion discourse. I'm a writer, creative consultant, and editorial director at Days Media. We're here doing the Rubric panel on gender.
I am a stylist, editor, consultant, and I am the global fashion editor at large for Vogue magazine, which is a handful of a title, but it means I put pretty clothes on pretty people.
I'm a model and stylist, and I'm also the fashion director at Interview magazine.
I'm a London-based stylist and creative director, and I work at a magazine called Perfect.
I'm content director at Net-a-Porter. I'm a writer, editor, head up Porter magazine and lots of our marketing content at Net-a-Porter. Very happy to be here.
Were there any people that you particularly looked up to, and did you notice a lack of people who looked like you, and did that impact you?
Well, I'll start. I was obsessed with fashion as a kid, and I really wanted to be a model. And then because I didn't see anyone that looked like me, I thought that was probably not really possible. And I started to explore different ways to engage with fashion. And it wasn't until, college when I realized that being a fashion editor was an actual job, and like being a stylist was a job. And I think the person that I could connect to the most at the highest level of fashion to me, which was always Vogue magazine, I always wanted to go there, was Andre Leonteli. And I remember, for better or for worse, being shocked that he was there. And I remember thinking, well, he had to be so extraordinary to get into that room, because you can't look like us and be like us and be in that room. So I have to be extraordinary to get there. And he really set a benchmark of excellence in terms of expectation. I feel like I spent a lot of my life as a kid really wanting to prove that I was worthy of being in the rooms that I was in, rather than feeling like, an innate sense of that.
I mean, I was always sort of obsessed with clothes and like dressing up and taking pictures too. Like I had like a digital camera, and I would always make my little sister sort of like, we would do like pictures and stuff. And that's always kind of been the case. I think I was really like obsessed by like movies and like kind of fairy tales and clothes. I didn't really know what fashion was like in the strict sense, or, almost like I didn't really like understand even what like Vogue was, kind of maybe just sort of like through teen magazines that like I would have seen what clothes and fashion were, like, because I was obsessed with Britney Spears and like, like pop stars and Destiny's Child, and like seeing like what they wore. And I didn't really understand what fashion was until high school. And my best friend was like online looking at like style.com and people who like had fashion blogs, because that was like kind of the pinnacle moment of that thing. And she showed it to me. And so we were like, oh my God, I can't believe these people like take pictures of their outfits and they get dressed up and like live these fun lives. And, now I didn't realize that people maybe just dressed up to take the picture. So like, I really internalized that. And so we would go every day to school in like some new crazy outfit that we like, went to the thrift store, like went to the mall and like kind of made and put together, and then like would take pictures of our outfits every day. So I have like a picture of myself every day from high school, because we just documented it. And so it was this thing that became this way of remembering my life, and what I was doing was like to do it through dressing up and like taking, and documenting that. And so it became this thing where it was just like this kind of like very like obvious like next step to kind of make that a job, but I didn't really even realize that it was fully.
I appreciate the really like accessible points of how you accessed fashion, because I think I definitely think I was, excavating the magazines, and I would always do this thing. I would look at an editorial, and then I would flip and look at the credits. That was like my big thing. I was like, I remember I was like, who is Pat McGrath? What is Guido? It became a lot more sophisticated as I like got older, but it was that, and it was really basic things. Like in the UK, we had this TV show called The Clothes Show. All my British friends will know, or Jeanie and Alice will know that. But like that was a huge thing for me. It came from all of these different sides. But yeah, American, kind of pop culture, like I always say, growing up in the mid 2000s and all of that influence. It was not that it was my particular perfect taste, but it was a foray into understanding there was this different world. And then it got more kind of sophisticated as I went on, and I learned about amazing people. I learned about people like Alice's dad, who was an incredible Black British designer, and they're such a rarity, and it got a little bit more sophisticated. But I love that you were like, it was really about like friends and personal style, because that was it as well. Like I wasn't always wearing great stuff. There was definitely an Abercrombie and t-shirt in my...
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Double popped polo collars, unfortunately.
Yes.
The clutch it had on the culture. Yeah.
I think we're all guilty of that. But actually, for me, it was kind of the opposite experience because my family or my parents worked in the industry. I was so jealous of my friends whose parents worked in finance or were lawyers and doctors. And I was like, why can't I just be like them? Because mine was a bit more unorthodox and my friends didn't really get it. And I also didn't have a creative bone in my body as a little kid. And my brother was this amazing drawer and they all were kind of unified in this creative approach. And I just knew I loved words. And so completely rejected fashion until I was a teenager. And that was when, I discovered all of these amazing editorials because sometimes you really just want to reject everything that you're born into. So yeah. I was so not into fashion initially, and it came actually a bit later in the day. And then inevitably here I ended up, but my parents were actually really keen for me not to join the fashion industry like them.
I always had a love of fashion and always had a love of clothes, but never understood what that meant for me or how that worked. I knew I didn't have enough of a voice to be a fashion designer. I just didn't think I had anything to say, which is a bit of a lie. I've got a lot to say, weirdly. But I was obsessed with TV and films and magazines and image consumption. So I'd spend all of my money on magazines, rip them to shred and make collages. And like Lynette, I was very much into kind of credits, who did what and what everyone's role was. And it wasn't until I went away to uni and then I studied art history and classics and came back and was I wanted to be an art curator and realized that they don't earn any money. And you have to have this extraordinary amount of wealth in order to do that job. I didn't know it was a fake job until you sort of go for an internship and you're like, oh wait, it's a fake job, lol, okay. So then I sort of had to come back and reset and then think about other things I liked and then, sort of end up falling into this industry.
Just to bring it back to also seeing people that resembled me, I kind of started reading magazines at the precipice of where there were Black models. I remember vividly Edward's all Black issue. I remember running to get that issue, or we had kind of gotten out of Naomi being the only Black model. But for me, where I got more excitement was exactly like you, Gabby, there's this editor called Andre Leon Talley, or I think there was an editor called Michael Roberts who worked at Vanity Fair.
Vanity Fair. Yeah.
So chic. So I used to Google these people, or Pat was a huge thing because I was just who creates these magical makeup looks that I love, and it was her all the time. I didn't find anyone that really looks like me. Actually, probably everyone on this call, through us all coming up together at certain bubble points, were the first people that were young enough and in our kind of social set. But I definitely think it was those kind of vanguard people who were kind of long in the tooth and amazing and set the agenda for all of us. We talked about getting into the industry, but did you ever feel any feelings about your race, about your identity, about your kind of being different, or, not assimilating into this industry from the offset? Jeanie, you had said you wanted to be an art curator, but you realized early on that required a lot of wealth. I actually think fashion is exactly the same. Well, it was. I think it's easier and it's become easier now, but I was I'm not rich enough to do this.
I mean, the first place I worked was Tatler. So had I known, I don't know what I was thinking. I was I'll just go for this one place that doesn't earn any money. So there's another place with extreme wealth. I come from a background where I was always the only Black kid everywhere. So I'm so familiar in those spaces that I almost just I know who I am and I hold my own. It's not until I kind of got further and further throughout the industry that I looked around and I was where the fuck is everybody else and what is this? The job I got at Tatler was, via, it was code switching. I've got a double barrel name. It sounds a little bit fancy. People think I'm 5'11" and I'm 5'6" and quite round. And I came in and I remember seeing everyone's look on their face and I was it's going to be really awkward if you turn me away now. And I was supposed to stay there for 2 weeks and I ended up interning for about a year. Still to this day, one of the nicest places I ever worked. But it was, I was so used to kind of always being on my own that it sort of just didn't twig with me until much later on.
Jeanie, that's so funny. I had exactly the same experience. My first ever job was a fashion assistant at Tatler. I think my double-barreled name got me through the door too. And they're probably shit in the elevators at Vogue House when you come up. But for me, I'm so grateful for my time there, and it was a massive learning curve. But I'm also used to always being, well, was at that time the only Black person in many rooms, and now thankfully that is changing. But it was a struggle at Tatler because that is such an old school establishment, society focused title, and people perceive you in a certain way. And I think, you know, I remember a couple of people early on in my career asking me if I'm mixed race, and I was really defiantly like, no, I'm full Black. But for them, I guess I was more palatable, so that was their way of seeing me and making me more accessible. And, you know, I had straighter hair and paler skin, and it was even then my kind of first understanding of colorism, I guess, this question of mixed race, because how is that even relevant? How are you allowed to ask me that as one of my first questions? But that wasn't necessarily at Tatler, but there I certainly felt, being in Vogue House, there was definitely at that time, 14 years ago, a very different type of person in the building than there is today.
I kind of remember the same feeling, although I found like one person who was, you know, not a person of color, but didn't come from extraordinary wealth, wasn't in the role because of nepotism or connections. And I remember the conversation we had as interns in which she was like, yeah, it's just like so hard being different. And I was like, I get what you're saying. And she was like, no, but you don't, because like, I'm so close to what they are. Like, I'm so close to being that, but you're just so far away from it that you don't even have to worry about assimilating, because like you never could be. And it was supposed to be this conversation of like, just be you because you'll never be them, and like that will be to your service. But it really ended up making me feel as if the way towards feeling comfortable in these spaces was camouflaging, because I couldn't assimilate. So it was like, how do I like mask the things about me that are different? And that was really traumatic. And it's something that I'm definitely working through now that I have an established anchor in the industry. But I think those of us who grow up in these predominantly white communities are, sometimes we can adapt this thinking that because we're so different, we have to like play to that difference to be deemed like worthy of being in the space. Like there is that like mascot concept. There is that like, there's only enough space for one of us. And that bred in me this like fierce competition that in the end of the day paid off, because I was willing to stay there latest, get there the earliest, do all of the work, do like not make a fuss about not being in the glamorous roles. And I kind of weaseled my way into, you know, a higher plateau within the industry. But I think representation at that moment, like being able to see somebody who looked like me, would have really freed me from the sense of like performativeness. Like, how can I be the good Black girl that like gets to the top? And that's something I'm still definitely working through. And I think a lot of people are still working through, despite all of us being in the room now and there being people to look at. Like, we're so indoctrinated and trained in this idea that fashion serves a certain type of person, should be made by a certain type of person, should be put on and purchased by a certain type of person. And a lot of people, I think, agree that that is still like a burden that we carry.
For me, it's like I have a different experience looking at fashion. I didn't not see people who looked like me. I thought I sort of was like in my mind, because when I was starting to like look at magazines and see what ID was and Days was, and you know, and sort of what was kind of trendy, and even like Italian Vogue or whatever at the time was sort of these androgynous kind of people. And in my mind, I was like, I'm gonna go and see those kinds of people are gonna be all over in fashion, and you know, they are, but then you almost sort of realize a lot of the times you are kind of the only person in the room who identifies in a different way, or is trans, or actually has that experience, and it's not just like a look they paint on, like it's not this surface kind of visual thing, that they actually are and live a lifestyle that is, or like live an experience that is different than that of other people around them. And sort of that kind of always kind of like was sort of a weird like dissonance. Like it was kind of like, oh, am I supposed to pretend not to like fashion because I'm supposed to like be someone that they just put this onto, and I'm not actually this way. And then, but I was like, I can't pretend to not be that. I can't pretend to sort of like know less, or not like it less, or want it less, or be it less, or something, or whatever. And it was like when I first moved to New York, I was sort of seeing there were these like independent shows they'd be doing in New York, and it would be like these cast of all trans models or something. But then I got here, and I was like, well, the things that I like grew up like really obsessing over and loving were these sort of bigger industry things, and sort of trying to do something in that universe. It felt very weird that like I would go, and then, you know, it'd be like I'd be the only person there who was trans, and now it's very different. Now I go to castings or something or whatever, like do shows, and there's a bunch of other girls there, and they have no clue that it's even like that, like there's even like a wall in front of them because they're 18 years old, and like finding more about fashion and sort of getting that more sophisticated view of it and like learning more. I realize, and I look back at the history, there's like people there, you know, and like I didn't realize who they were when I was a teenager. And, you know, it's like Connie Fleming and Terry Toy. If I had known who they were when I was younger, I feel like it would have like really changed a lot for kind of my vision of myself.
Something that's really important to note is just the visibility and awareness part of it that we didn't really have. I mean, the internet existed. It wasn't like back in my day, but it was, you know, I do think like the only way I ever saw, you know, editorials from back in the day was like on the fashion, was anyone a fashion spot junkie? I would go and like look at the forums.
Oh my God.
That was what I did.
It was crazy.
It was crazy.
How about the fact that now probably every single person on this call has a fashion spot forum thread?
Oh, and
that like trashing them. I have a thread of people trashing me, or people being like, "This is really cool," and like it's, you know, it's great that there are editors who are like working now that like absolutely we're probably on the fashion spot like I am right now. Like we're Grace Coddington and Phyllis Posnick, they had no idea that the fashion spot existed, and people were like, there was huge discourse about their work. Now it's like low-key Google alerting your work, you know what I mean, and seeing what people are talking about. But it's really cool that now the conversations that they're having are conversations about work made by gender nonconforming people, trans people, Black women, fat women. It's like that used to be, we were all just sitting around talking about older white women for like our entire lives. So
no, it's really true. I definitely am not going to go down a fashion spot rabbit hole looking for my name. I definitely don't.
Do it.
No, there's no need for that. Just having an idea of what was going on was so like important. And Dara, I'm so glad you brought up all of the you know, people from the 70s and before that, of just that was so, I think it's so affirming to understand that you kind of aren't always the first person. It's just you have to kind of excavate those stories.
I know, whenever I see like sort of like, oh, this is the first da 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 da, I'm like, are you sure? Like if you knew, like you wouldn't say that, and then we wouldn't be here thinking like, oh my God, we're never here, and it's gonna be so hard for us to enter. You know what I mean? Because it's like you look back at the history and they've always been there, and they've always sort of been part of the creative process in a way that's even more than just sort of like I showed up at a casting and they put a dress on me and they sent me out. Like they've been part of the being a muse to these like people who are so legendary and have made such impactful work or whatever. And so like I think, you know, places like the Fashion Spot or something, or like talking about or like looking at things from the past and having access to that as like a person who has no like interaction with the industry at all, from like a small town or, you know, or whatever, somewhere like completely outside of fashion, or a big hub like New York or LA or something, like, or London or Paris or something. It's like, you know, it's like maybe we're not in those, maybe people who look like us are not in those pictures, but it's like, do those pictures mean any less to us? Are they any less ours once they're put in the world? Like, why is that not my picture too? Why is that not your picture too? You know, once it's like, you know, once it hit you when you're like 14 and you looked at, you know, I don't know, Natalia Vodyanova falling down a rabbit hole, like, is that not your picture too now? You know, like, why does that not represent you if you felt like it took you somewhere, even if it's, you know, like a girl who like has no bearing on like a similarity of identity to you, because she's not, that's not really her even either anymore. It's like this symbol and this like sort of like thing that makes you dream and think and believe in something. And it's not, and it's important to be in those and to change who's it gets to be in those pictures. But it's like those things from the past are still all of ours. You know what I mean? I feel.
And I do think that us not always having immediate access to people who we identify with in terms of who they are, what they look like in those spaces and in those images is by design. Like, I don't think it's like lack of excavation. That is part of it. And we have like immediate access to information that we never would have had as kids because the internet has changed dramatically. But it's like, there really was this idea that it is easier to see fantasy and put yourself in kind of like mask an image of Natalia Vodyanova falling down a rabbit hole with yourself because she's white. Like that fantasy would stop stops if she was Black, or that fantasy stops if she was fat, or if she was gender nonconforming. First of all, everybody should do what they want. Like, the idea that there are rules on how to engage with fashion is like such a bizarre, insane concept to me, because fashion was always supposed to be for and by outsiders. But I really do think I feel I have a responsibility to be like very freaking visible, like on the gram, like always talking, calling shit out, because you have to see it to believe it. Like, you're a dreamer, Dara, and I think all of us are dreamers, but I think there are kids who are like, if it's not modeled, it doesn't exist.
Right, yeah.
And so it comes into this weird thing, but the idea that like, this town isn't big enough for the both of us. It's like, okay, well, we, you know, kind of found Black men to an extent, like we like accepted them within the realm of like acceptability within white, exclusive, rich fashion. And like, that's kind of enough. And then it was like, this is an industry that's about women. This is an industry that's predominantly, like a lot of creative fields, like built on the backs of BIPOC women, but there just isn't the same like reverence for Black women in this industry, because they aren't canonized, because they're erased and masked in the history of the genesis of the industry. Anyway, all to say, I want all of y'all to be out there on your grams being loud and amazing, because people need to see it. Like, we're here, we've been here, no one's quieting down, get used to it.
A mandate from Gabriella Karefa-Johnson. I wanted to segue into race and gender, actually. This industry is built, catered, sustained off of the backs and the desirability and the dollar and the discussion and discourse around women, but is largely operated by men. Even if I look at the creative directordom of most of our fashion houses, not to say that those people aren't incredibly talented, but I do find it incredibly disheartening in a way that there aren't more women at the helms of these houses discussing and having some ideas or cultural output and creative output on how women should dress. It's why, to me, I remain and always will be a Phoebe Philo fan, because I do think there was, bar the, crazy prices. This is not to say I was running out to a Celine store and buying everything, but I loved the idea that this was someone who really put the thought and the onus on how women dressed at the forefront and had really clear, distinct ideas about it. And they weren't oppressive, like the luxe sneaker or the jacket with the big pockets. This is clearly a woman who was thinking about how other women live their lives. And I'd love to see that as more of a part of fashion discourse, as an example. But I'd love to understand from you guys how you think your position as a woman and a woman of color in the industry kind of intersects, and where you see that flourishing and where you see that being challenged.
Well, sadly, I think it feels more jarring in our industry because it's fashion, but that's the case for every field. It's white men in suits at the top. So it is what it is, but seeing us all here together, it's changing and it's slow and it's painful, but we're getting there. And even coming to a brand like Net-a-Porter, which I did 2 years ago, I'm surrounded by women. And in terms of our senior leadership team, it's predominantly women. And that feels incredibly refreshing for me. And not to say that, at the very top of most of these companies, and when you go to the shareholders and, the very top, it might still be men again, but in 10 years' time, I think there's going to be a change. And we've just got to keep fighting and pushing all of these people here on this panel. And I think the change will come about faster within our industry, certainly, than a lot of others. So I feel a slight optimism around that.